tanks. The first, third and the holy trinity of classes in video games. The great protector, the bullet sponge of the team. But is this really the best way to design them? Shouldn't they fill a other role? While tanks just being bullet sponges isn't that big of an issue in most games, there are sometimes just games where sustain from other sources are so high that the tanks just doubling down on that creates some of the worst matters. With that being the case, the question rises if tanks really always should fill that role, or if they just should completely ignore the part of protecting their team and fill a completely different role. Overwatch, for example, already answered this question for itself by switching their tank designs from more defensive characters like Sigma to more offensive characters like Mauga. Even their more defensive characters like Ram aren't just pure defense anymore and also allow you to just frontline and deal damage and fight in actual combats. Even Marvel Rivals doesn't have that many defensive characters in their tank roster, with the only real characters that protect their team actively being Strange and Magneto. But is this shift really good for hero shooters in general? I personally would say yes. But to really say why, we would have to dive into why the protector tanks cause the problem. So let's talk about. Disclaimer: I never really played Overwatch back then, so I never experienced the meta myself. All the information I have here is from what I've seen on YouTube and researched myself. For anyone who doesn't know, the Goats meta essentially was a meta where team comps consisted of 3 tanks and 3 healers. The most prominent tanks during this time were Ryan and Zarya, which were essentially in every single team. For the healers, every team essentially had Brick and Lucio. The third healer as well as the third tank varied throughout the meta. This caused the game to be very slow because of the high durability of all the heroes as well as the high healing. In addition, DPS also got very ineffective because of the high shields and healing. They weren't able to break through anymore, so making it that the only viable strategy against goats was goats, which made the game very slow and leading to many players quitting the game. Sadly, this wasn't the only meta where a very defensive strategy dominated the game, because right after goats, the next one followed up with. Even though team comps switched back from 3 tanks and 3 healers to 2 tanks, 2 healers and 2 DPS, the game didn't really go any faster because the tanks now were Sigma and Orisa. 2 of the most defensive games in the game, with both having a barrier that they could place nearly anywhere. In addition, barriers back then were much stronger, with for example Sigma barrier having 1.5k HP. This meta was for most people about as unenjoyable as Goats was, with most fights just ending up as 2 bastions firing at shields. For example, the background keep still lasts another 40 seconds. This caused Blizzard to change many things, like making Overwatch 2 5v5 with only 1 tank, and from what I can see also making them change their tank design philosophy. So, now that we know what they have done, let's take a look at how they have done it. For that, let's examine some of the worst offenders individually, meaning Reinhardt, Zarya and Sigma. Let's start with Reinhardt, who I would consider to be the least problematic of these 3, even though he was the cornerstone of Goats. This is even though his giant shield should make him the worst offender. The fact that he is a melee character with engage doesn't just enable him but also encourage him to play more aggressive and engage on the enemy team so that he can apply pressure by himself. This essentially enables him to be tuned in a way where his hyperly defensive playstyle isn't viable and you need to play more aggressive, using his shield only for more personal defense, like when retreating from an engage. But that also means that with bad tuning he can be the worst offender of them all. This is caused by him being a melee character, making it that he can't really do much besides keeping his barrier up and maybe casting his E from time to time when he is fighting on range. This causes fights against him to be very slow, as you first have to take down a giant barrier just for him to then charge into your team and get into a range where he can actually fight in. Meanwhile, on your team, half the cooldowns have been burned, as your team wasn't just attacked by the enemy DPS but also their healers, as they didn't have to heal their own backline. This gets even worse when you add the second problem child to the mix, Zarya. With her doing not much more than just shielding her allies, she might as well just be a misclassified support. The only thing speaking against that being her passive, which stores damage blocked by her shields and converts it into bonus damage on her main attacks. But when you consider that most supports have either a damage buff or can attack while healing, it only balances things out. With that being said, I also think Zarya has the easiest fix of all the tanks, that being just removing her bubble on allies. This changes her from being a third or maybe even fourth support to being just a pure bullet sponge, which still isn't great, but definitely healthier for hero shooters like Overwatch. And lastly, there is the icon for Protector tank, Sigma. And even just his left and right click should make it obvious for why that is the case. His left click shoots two projectiles with bounce off walls and explode when your enemies or after a certain distance traveled. His right click sends out a huge barrier which you can place at nearly any position. From this, you can already see that his play pattern essentially boils down to him sending out shields and poking down his enemies. This problem then gets extended further to his other two abilities, from which only one has any kind of offensive power. That being his rock. With this, he throws out a giant rock which stuns the first enemy hit. And even the offensive opportunities that this ability can provide are very limited. This is mainly to it being very slow and also having a very short range, making it that even though it technically can be used offensively, it isn't really realistic to consistently use it that way. And the last ability just makes things even worse, since it just absorbs enemy attacks, converting them to a shield when it ends. And these three are just the characters that I would call the most defensive in this game, since nearly every character has some sort of defensive ability, be it Winston's bubble or D.Va's projectile delete. This essentially makes the fights very defense oriented, since you have 3 characters which sustain your team, 4 if you're playing 6v6, allowing strategies like goats or double shields to even exist. In addition, this defensive orientation of the fights makes them very slow, making it feel like you never make progress when trying to push. This creates frustration since it always feels like you're in a stalemate and can't win or make any progress at all. You might think this shouldn't be that bad, since many other games, like for example League of Legends, have characters which work in a very similar way. While this is definitely true, these games usually also have a way lower healing output from their supports and also only have 1 instead of 2. This makes it that in most other games, characters that get to low health will stay there for a long time, while in games like Overwatch, a single attack can make the difference between a character dying or getting healed back to full life. But how would you fix this problem? Well, you just make the tank what a counterpart to a support would really look like. Just like nearly all of the tanks have some sort of defensive ability, nearly all of them also have some offensive ability, most of the time containing crowd control or CC for short. This makes tanks instead of protectors frontline characters which enable your team to engage on the enemy, allowing your DPS to kill enemies while still feeling like a tank because you're still very durable, and because of you being the first to go in, you still also pull aggro from the enemies. Focusing more on this part of the identity makes it that hyper defensive teams don't come to exist, and the tank identity of the characters doesn't go missing. To have an example of how this works in practice, let's take a look at one of Overwatch's newer tank heroes, Mauga. Even though Mauga is one of the most hated, if not the most hated hero in the game, I still think that he is probably one of the better designed tanks. This is because he works perfectly in the way I just described disruptor tanks. And he does this with essentially just 2 abilities. The first one being his charge, which ends in a ground stomp, slowing and stunning nearby enemies. And his second ability being an ability which allows him to heal himself based off damage dealt. There is also a passive which grants him over health for every crit, but since this ability is essentially why most people hate him, mainly because it supports a play pattern where it just focus the tank instead of priority targets, I'm going to ignore it for this conversation. especially since it is just a passive version of his E, meaning that discussing it wouldn't really reveal anything new about his play pattern. Like I already said, his play pattern is essentially the exact thing I described at the start of this section. With him charging in with his shift, stunning enemies and slowing them, while at the same time drawing in enemy fire which you are able to survive thanks to your E. In addition, you can use your ult when it's up, which will create a huge cage restricting the enemy movement even more. When done well, these plays allow your team to engage on the enemy team and start a team fight. Usually with an advantage allowing you to win the team fight. This offensive potential also makes it that when compared to characters like Sigma, you aren't nearly as dependent on enemy mistakes or ults to make offensive plays, but also able to seek them out yourself. This makes it so that you are the one that controls the flow of the game. You call which fights you will take and which fights you will pass. This makes it, even though you don't protect your team at all, it doesn't feel like any part of the tank identity is missing from the kit. And that's because there isn't. Let me explain. Shields don't just block damage. If that's all they did, they wouldn't really do much. The more important part is that they allow your team to play more aggressive, position in ways they otherwise couldn't, allowing them to take fights they otherwise shouldn't be allowed to. And you are the one that controls all of that. You control how they position, you control which fights they can take. Protector tanks and disruptor tanks don't distinguish in the role they have, but in the way they execute it. While the protector tank's way is slow and makes the game feel stale, the disruptor tank's way is fast and makes the game feel fluid. In addition to making the game flow feel more fun, the kits are also just way more satisfying. For proof of that, just download Marvel Rivals, play a few games of Thor, Venom or Captain America, and then play a game of Magneto. You will quickly see how much more boring he is. With that being said, I don't think that tanks should have no defensive abilities, especially since you still pull enemy aggro, you should have at least abilities that allow you to protect yourself. What I do think is that abilities which just protect your team should be replaced with abilities that allow you to start fights and engage the enemy team. Lastly, even though this isn't that important anymore to the video, I still wanna provide proof to a statement I made earlier into the video, that being that Overwatch changed their tank design philosophy. Starting with the newer heroes like Mauga, Rabbitam or Junker Queen. From all of the tanks that have been added since Overwatch 2, only one of them has gotten a barrier ability. And even he has an ability which wants him to go into melee range and fight enemies up close. The defensive utility the other tanks provide to their team is either very small or non-existent. Even the tank reworks did the same thing, with Orisa's rework replacing her barrier with an ability that only protects herself. Even the non-reworked tanks didn't escape this entirely. All of their defensive abilities did get nerfed in some way or another, and all of their offensive abilities did get buffs. Making it that even though they have the same kit, you want to use it different to get the maximum potential out of it. With this, we've reached the end of this video. If you have any questions, different opinions, or if I missed anything, just let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed it, and bye.